Righto, let's kick off our Conformance Friday. Next Friday, by the way, will be a ballot reconciliation Friday, which will also include some of the must support content in it, but it won't be a usual Conformance Friday. Kind of a reminder to people that this is more of an informal sort of meeting where we're walking through and building on things, and doesn't have the usual business or typically any of the voting that we would do in a standard TDG. So he's going to kick us off. We're going to continue with what we've been working on around must support and obligation and start to look at what that looks like in the AU Core IG. And I think we're looking today on to confirm what we're really in agreement on around these points that we've been working on. So I'll hand over to you, Heath.
Thank you. So yeah, the team's been working pretty hard since last Friday, and we've actually had some updates from HL7. So they've just published a new version of the obligation codes as an official extension pack, and due to some changes that we have requested, they've actually obliged, and hence I have to revisit all the theory that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks around obligation codes. So what we've been talking about is an obligation code called populate, which was defined as if a value shall include the element if a value is known and allowed to be shared. And this, we felt at the time, it well defined what our intent was for Australia's must support requirements. But there was a bit of a trick to that, and we didn't want to pain you with the details at the time until we knew where HL7 was going to go with this. But the complication was that it inherited from an obligation code called able to populate, and this has been causing the US core systems some significant issues. So if I just point out the able to populate, I retrospectively should have done that one first. It was defined as be able to correctly populate this element, and if we look at the notes on the right hand side, it says needs to demonstrate during some conformance testing process that there are some conditions under which it populates the element with a correct value. And this is and the American vendors have had to basically, through the conformance, demonstrate the ability to provide that element even though they didn't have the concept in their system. And in other words, they've had to knock up something just for the case of getting across conformance. So we objected to that because the populate one, which seemed on the surface was what we wanted to do, being is known and allowed to be shared. We were expecting them just to detach that inheritance, but they didn't. What they did was add in a new obligation code called populate if known, which almost did what we intended, but just sort of was a little bit softer in that it was, if you know the value of the element, then you should correctly populate it. But there was nothing about the allowed to be shared. All right, so we've gone with that. And if we look at the notes on the right-hand side, it kind of elaborates or provides a little bit of context to their intent here, that basically it does not impose a requirement to be able to know a value. And I think that's a little bit easier to understand than perhaps the definition itself in the middle, which gets a little bit clumsy with the language. But effectively, it's that clause, unlike populate and able to populate, which do impose a requirement to be able to know a value at some time. So a little bit tricky to get the head around it, but we've effectively, in the last week, changed all our definitions to using this new obligation code, populate if known. And I can't see the list at the moment. Richard, I was expecting someone to put their hand up. Thank you.
What I'm thinking about is, do they have an idea of allowed to be shared is a blanket requirement, and so you don't need to mention any particular spot? That would explain why they haven't included such text?
No, so the only place that's allowed to be shared is actually in populate, but because it inherits from the able to, it gives us that additional requirement to always know something, or to be able to demonstrate with its ability to be populated. So we've just gone with that softer one, but we are considering a change request, I believe, Daniel. That's at least we've talked about it, that to go back to them and include that that idea of sharing as part of if known.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether, because in a sense, allowed to share is a thing that can apply to pretty much anything. And so by not having something about allowed to share, meaning in a sense that it's not available, so if they've got some concept around like that, then they've already met what we want. But that get out thing is somewhere else in the system, which basically says if you're not allowed to share it, then for the purposes of this interaction, you don't have it. So if they've got something like
just
that,
bear with me for a second, Richard, and because I've got another slide later on, which I'm going to basically summarize where we're all going with this, and we've got to round it another way, effectively. So just bear with me for perhaps 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll come back to that if you don't mind.
So I will note, Richard, that yes, they may mean that. I suspect they don't, but I think we'll raise a JIRA anyway to get them to confirm for us if they do, and therefore we'll later on add that, or if they really didn't mean that, so that we have that clarity.
Yeah, but we've got to round it another way, and I'll come back to that in a little way in a moment. So I'll come back to able to populate, just to give anyone the opportunity to ask questions around this, because what we've actually found is a situation where we actually want to state this in one of our obligations for one of our must support elements scenarios, which I'm about to go into. Is there any sort of questions on the definition of able to populate at this point in time? No.
On able to populate or populate if known?
Able to populate.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I want to ask on populate if known is, that's a hard one to test. It's wonderful demand, but it's a hard one to test.
Yeah.
Because if somebody says, I never know it, can they just say, well, then I pass this one because I never know it? Agreed. Is that something we want to have as a case? I would say probably, yeah. If you can never populate it, then you meet the populate if known condition as stated.
And I think that's actually a really good way of describing the difference between the two of them, is exactly what you're saying. One is that you can test, whereas the other one is really almost a trust thing, unless you start diving into the specifics of a particular vendor's system. Ask them, show me that you don't have this in your database, or show me that you don't have this on your screen. It's kind of a non-computable testing mechanism that would have to support that. Okay, so where we left off last week was I started to introduce the idea of choice of a data type. So at the moment, for example, in procedure, we've got the choice of performed data types. And the definition that we've really got around this particular case at the moment, where we've got a choice, is that a responder shall populate this element with at least one data type allowed by the element definition, whilst the AU core requester needs to support all. But what we want to do, as we've been discussing, is actually say, well, we want the responder to be able to provide us with a date time if they've got one. So we don't want them to be able to, we're really trying to say this is something that as a minimum obligation for you to support at least 8 times, so that we've got some level of interoperability. And we've got no way of, haven't stated that yet in AU core. And as I indicated last week, US core is basically putting my supports on the data types, and their current definition for this is that they shall be capable of, and that's equivalent to the is able to scenario, but also for the requester, they shall be capable of processing the performed date time, but they may support others, and we determined that that was potentially problematic because a requester may not actually have the ability to be able to support one of the other types, even though the responders are allowed to or may send something. So there's a bit of a gap in our interoperability there at this point in time. So the requester obligation is only to support performed date time, even though the responder may send something like a period or an age. So I didn't know what to do with that situation last week. But what I've worked through over the last few days is by using the be able to correctly populate, using that be able to obligation on the responder is basically saying you shall be able to provide that. But still on the requester, they need to support all.
I believe how that lays. So the performed would have, so responder is shall populate if known. So if you have performed, whether that's date, time, period, string, age, range, if you have it, send it. If you don't send it. And on the requester side at the element level, that's you shall be able to accept a resource without error if it has any of the valid data types, be that date, time, period, string, age, or range. It might not be what you want, and that's business rules later on, and you may reject resources for not conforming to those. And when we if we choose to, and I'm on the fence about it at the moment, but I think it could be workable to go further on date time to add the able to populate is therefore requesting an AU for responder who says they do procedure to be able to demonstrate the capability that they can send back date times. They may never have that data or they may often send back periods or strings because that's the data that's present, but they have to build in and be able to demonstrate the capability of date time. The requester still has to be able to accept without error any valid, I guess, instance of performed, whether it's period, string, age, range.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the real benefit is of adding that capability, like able to is fine, but in any particular instance, it may not be populated, the date time. So I'm not sure what you're really gaining by
we're
having
basically
that constraint.
saying that this is, you need to at least support this one and demonstrate that you can in certain circumstances where you've got data to provide that. So you have no choice but supporting this one. You need to demonstrate the ability to do so. But if for whatever case of data, someone, like for example, we know systems that may capture a procedure performed at a particular age versus on a particular date. So in that particular case, the system, the responder would still provide the age, but they should also be able to, in other cases, at least provide date time. So it's their choice of what other types they support, but they have to at least support.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the win is in terms of achieving interoperability, because basically, if I have a procedure that's always recorded as a period, always, because that's my entry requirements, and then I have to cripple it to allow just a start date so I can demonstrate date time. And then I'll never send date time alone, because I'm never going to allow anything but periods.
So are you basically suggesting that we don't need to ever specify?
I think it's actually
support on date time.
I think must support on date time is actually much more important if there's a processing requirement on the client. Because if and US Core has that, right? US Core has a processing must support for date time, which I think actually has value, because I think that's where you say if you do send a date time as a responder, the client and a compliant client will process the date time.
So you actually want to strengthen the requester to be something like a handle.
Well, I'm only saying that's the only value I see from the responder side. I think I don't see the real value if you natively your system doesn't have that concept, and it's
Daniel,
which I guess I was going to say that one, Brett, the one that you can that has to be downstream if that kind of thing would go in. That can't be AU core. That's too limiting to downstream use cases.
No, but like the thing is like that to have that. Like, to me, I would populate date time as a responder if I knew the clients were going to make use of it. And the fact that we don't have any of those requirements, why would we bother having that constraint? Like, why would we mark it as must support? Because it's an arbitrary. To me, it's pretty arbitrary, unless you want to force everyone into a date time pattern exclusively, I think.
Well, I don't think that we can do that. And I think we've heard last meeting that there is too many use cases where the others need to be supported from a responder's perspective. But we also perhaps want to put a stake in the ground to say date time is really our, if you like, preferred. The other option I think that we talked about was moving it to a should rather than a shall. So I'm interested. Yeah, Andy. Oh, sorry, Richard, you're at the top of the list. I'm assuming you're first.
I'm wondering what you want to do with this stuff. If I've got a system and I have within my system a perform period, and I have the smarts in my system to be able to pull out a date time and populate that, and to convert it to a string and send it that way, and to make it into a range, and even to calculate the person's age and send it to that. So I'm in the position to send anything. So how do I choose one to send? And then it's a case of, well, guess what? The clients the requesters have to understand anything I send. So I'm not sure that this shall be able to populate thing has said anything to me, because I can send anything. If I'm another system where I have performed as strings and only as strings, and I can't make them into dates, then I'm going to fail conformance because I can't make them into date times. But even if I make them into even if I can make them to date times and just don't, and just always send them as strings, then I become conformant. And then I meet this, and it won't make much difference to the downstream people because they've got to be able to process both date times and strings anyway. So I'm not sure what behavior it's trying to guarantee, what useful behavior it's trying to guarantee.
So I'll very quickly point back to what US Core is doing, and that they're basically saying out of these 5, US Core is only really making it a requirement for you to support date time from a responder and a requester's perspective. And I think that's what we would like to try and do as well, but tighten up the may part that's in their specification. So we kind of want to say everyone should be supporting date time as a minimum,
yeah,
but be a little bit more basically not allow this gap that's sitting in between where the requester might be in a situation where it's receiving something that it falls over and dies.
So
Andy,
on this interaction,
yep.
the responder could send a period, and that wouldn't be a problem because they're able to send a date time. So the responder sends a period, and then the requester gets a period, and they're enabled to say, "Don't send me a date time," and then the responder would then send the information again using a date time. And the requester couldn't say, "You've sent me the wrong format." They'd have to then accept it. Is that the sort of pathway that this is meant to support?
I'm happy to leave the question open and let's get some further discussion. I'm interested in other people's opinions on this.
Okay.
Andy. You're muted.
How's that? How's that?
Yes, sorry. Very faint, but yes.
Oh, sorry, I'll speak loud. I'm worried that we are trying to imply transformation behaviors on responders, because I don't think that's what we want to be doing at all. That there seems to be 2 basic patterns. You've got someone who's a requester, and I'm assuming this is still in the requesting realm, to contribute a piece of information into what will be a responder. The responder absorbs that information and is now going to be able to respond to requests against that information. Likewise, the responder may be a facade, which is simply a gateway from other information where there is some form of potentially transformation going on. And it worries me that we're overlaying into this in the name of interoperability, significant changes in our behavior around data. And I think we all want to avoid the existing artificial agency conformance processes where you truly do artificially create support for something and never use it. It's just a waste of time. Your system never is going to go near that. It seems that choosing daytime, as kind of Brett pointed out, if in all uses, period, makes far more sense for the application that you're actually dealing with than effectively imposing a retrospective move back to date time to be conformant. Seems to kind of impose the wrong message.
I understand where you're coming from with, you're implying there may be an implication, but it's certainly not the intent and certainly not my intent. It's more about just trying to give a little bit of a, so that's why we sort of talked about the term should. It's almost a recommendation that your
it's the
data
shell
should be in this type, but if you
it's the
have
shell
it,
that scares me.
yeah.
So
So-
can
I
at
think
this point,
there's going to be now a bifurcation. There's the set of uses of the resource that are happy to use date time and it fits into the model. And there's a whole other set of uses where date time isn't the model to use. And we're basically in AU Core saying you're outside of AU Core if you're going to use something other than date time.
So are you sort of, okay, I just wonder whether we want to get some sort of straw man around whether maybe this is harder than what we thought. And although we've got some ballot responses that we need to reconcile, it feels like we may be getting to a point where we're not comfortable enough to be able to progress this now. And
well, I think so. I think we should go to Landon, and then I'd like to ask the group to put a set of hands up on who is interested on putting must support on date time, because we are kind of hearing a number of voices that are of one camp, which I think we can actually take as progression, as having a potentially a clear view. So, Landon, if you want to comment.
So when I look at this, it seems to make perfect sense, but as mentioned by the others, I'm not sure we've identified all of the elements that we would want to put the must support on, I guess. And if we just look at this, that it's possibly R1 and we're going to add additional ones later, then the concept works pretty well. I think it's more of an identification of what do the vendors actually support and want as a baseline minimum. But as a baseline, I think it's really good. But perhaps we just need to investigate whether these need to be investigated further for what vendors actually use.
This isn't a simple example, I guess. There is a more complicated example in US Core, which is observation value, where they basically say you shall be capable of supporting codable quantity, and there's a third one I can't remember off the top of my head. So they've basically picked out 3 out of the 10 types or whatever, and said you shall be capable of, and keeping in mind the US Core term capable of, you must demonstrate whether you use it or not. And we're not quite going there, except on the responder side. All right, Danielle, you want to go you straw man?
I want to ask, can I get, so in AU Core R1, can I ask people to raise their hand if they're interested in must support on date time or must support on a specific combination, I guess, of data types like this on performed? All right, so there's 4 people, 5, I think there's a thumbs up there. So 5, so that's about 20%, I think. So the question then is, how do we progress? There is a ballot comment, but it seems like while we're interested, none of us can work out what that interest is, which to me is indicative that maybe this isn't R1. Maybe this is something we undertake for future consideration.
Can we ask who's against it?
Yes, we can. Sorry, who's against it? Sorry, please put your hand up.
Who's against what?
Who's against putting must support on date time, or I guess a combination of date time and some other elements? Okay, so there's more people coming through. So if we took a vote, that would pass.
There's the variance of shall versus should, though, as well.
There is. I mean, personally, I put my hand up because I'm not interested in either of those.
And there's a lot of people in the middle.
Yeah, so thank you. So there was about, I think we got up to 8 people there. So I think that's indicative that at least we've got some interest, but we've also got a group of people who can make decisions on this. So.
All right, so I think we progress without it at this point in time is, I think, the outcome. Yeah.
I think that is so there are a number of ballot comments out there, and I think what that gives to me is from this group that we should be saying this is a future consideration and not for R1 as the position we need to put forwards.
Okay, cool.
I think, Ruben, you've got your hand up, and Dylan, you also do. If there's still leftovers.
That was from the vote.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries. So that sounds to me like that's what we'll put forward in the block vote. We'll indicate why and that there's some work to do. And Andy?
Are you saying, maybe I'm a bit slow here, but are you saying that this is about all obligations, or is this about this particular obligation?
This one.
Okay.
And in fact, there's this one, and there's a couple of other resources where the ballot comment is to add must support on date time. So that's the specific we were discussing, not obligations in general. Well, thanks for that feedback. That's been really helpful, and that will form what comes out in the block vote to the technical design group for those ballot comments on the change request to add date time. Is we will put together the response that indicates some of the outcomes of this conversation and says that this is considered for future use and not for R1.
I just wonder whether we could put out another vote around the should. I don't know what the should would be on, but I mean, it sounds like that's your camp, Danielle. If you went the chair.
If you'd like to, we could. What would you like to ask people?
Maybe we just need another out of session on it to be clearer on what the proposal might be. But I personally, I've got to get my head around it as well. So
I think the proposal, because we have a lot of work to be done on this, is that it isn't for R1. That's what I'm thinking, basically.
I'm happy with that. All right, stay with status quo. So what I might just do quickly is just to finish out, going back to Richard's initial questions, was just to basically summarize all of the last few weeks of stuff to put forward the proposal of what we're putting into the updated must support page for AU core responder and AU core requester, and what must support means. So we are using the obligation codes from FHIR as the terms that we're using in our definitions. If we look at AU core responder, the first dot point is really a paraphrasing of the populate if known obligation. So shall correctly populate all must support elements if a value is known for the element. The second one is basically saying shall implement the requirements of suppressed data when an element is not allowed to be shared. And the third one is shall implement the requirements on missing data when an element is not known. So you can see there, Richard, we're basically working around the fact of allowed to be shared not being part of the populate if known scenario by that second dot point having its own requirement.
That's nice, because you do need to, it's good to provide guidance on what you do when you have it, but you're unallowed to share it. And this provides that guidance.
Is there any comment before I move on to the requester? Any people want to comment negatively to this? I guess I'll just briefly highlight the last point, which is that, and this leads on to, I guess, the next topic around obligation extensions. But basically, if we want to tighten these, this is the minimum obligation across the profiles. But if you want to make this more tightly stated in the profiles, then you can use an alternative obligation code in the obligation extensions on the element, if it's not populate. But that's going on to the next step. Okay, so no comments. So requester is really the accept the resources containing any valid value for must support elements without error, and they shall accept the resources containing must support elements with missing data or suppressed data without error. Andy.
I think we should, in thinking about using the must support option, just acknowledge the fact that there is significant overhead in systems, clients and servers dealing with a injection of these must support elements where otherwise they would not have done so. So I think both from someone who's receiving content with these must support options, and also generating data with these must support options, if it is a significant set, then that's a big overhead on implementers to build that support in.
Agreed. And I think that's really the whole reason why we're trying to get a clear understanding of what must support means, so that people can actually understand that overhead when we agree to these things being must support. And I guess the following on statement on this item here is how the actual requester processes the resource. All they have to do is accept it. They don't have to process it. That's up to their local requirements. And they obviously, as downstream profiles, for example, they can actually override that obligation further with terms such as rejecting, invalid, correctly handling, persisting, displaying, or ignore, etc. So again, we've got this framework based on obligation codes that will support downstream profiles and implementations as they see fit. Ruben.
Look, I think we're talking about this later in the agenda if we get to it, but the last statements on both left and right side about only requiring the obligation extension when the profile requires more tightly stated obligations. No surprise, I question that. So I'm wondering if we can consider this without those, if we can discuss where the obligation extensions applied later in the meeting.
I think it's a good segue to the next agenda item. Richard.
When looking at what we've got here for the responder, this doesn't give a responder any discretion when they think the data is not relevant to a particular interaction. So if I'm sending you a resource, I've got some data, it is available in my system, I could put it in, but I don't think it's part of our interaction. I think it's irrelevant in this situation. Now, I have to send it anyway. I can only stop it if I'm not permitted to share it. So I've got no discretion to leave out things that I believe are irrelevant. So in a sense, this is not so much must support the element as must supply the element. Is that what we want it to be? Because if it's that, then we have a very small set of things we want to put this on. So we'll be wanting to say in core, we'll only put this on things where you've got to send it, even if you think it's irrelevant to your use of this resource. And that's what we're asking for in this case.
I think it's
Is
actually,
that what we want?
It's actually more than must supply. It's actually shall correctly populate. So yeah, absolutely, completely agree with you. I'll leave it open. Danielle,
Well, I was going to say that is the obligation. Well,
Yeah.
I was. That's the obligation we've been talking about. That's exactly what it means. If you know it, send it. That's what we've defined as the default. So that's exactly what it means for an AU call responder.
And going back to Andy's point, you know, when we're talking about whether an element is must support or not, you need to be considering exactly what you're saying, Richard. Are there use cases when I don't want to provide this, and hence it's not must support?
Yeah, because the AU core profiles are defined as being, these are the minimum. Within obviously the AU core ecosystem. If your use case is outside it, you're not AU core. Yeah.
Yep. I wasn't wanting to argue against this interpretation. I just wanted it to be really clear to myself and to others that we were in fact coming to a very, a very demanding meaning of must support.
Well, it is a must and it is support, as you say, and we're qualifying that further. You must populate correctly, as in with valid data, unless you've got a reason to suppress it or it's missing. And I'm glad that perhaps you picked up on that, because it means that the definitions are actually working. Okay, so if there's no more commentary, I'll hand over to you, Danielle, for the next agenda item.
So I just had a, sorry, Dylan.
Sorry, just one question. So that shall correctly populate, I understand that, but that doesn't mean that the system, the responder has to capture that information. It's only that they populate it if they have it.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, that was the one you were saying, oh no, does it not mean that? That was the very original in AU core. We've moved to take it from that position, which is where we didn't want to be, around that. That's what's being called that be able to. And we've said that's not appropriate. And to take it back to this populate if known, which is yes, if you have it, send it. If you don't have it, then, well, the missing data comes in. But you don't have to build your system to capture something that you weren't already capturing.
Okay, thank you.
And obligation extension, I'll take that pass. Thank you, Heath, and I'll pass it on to Ruben.
Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, look, so just for background for everyone, the whole obligations approach in FHIR is really driven by this extension. And if our rules are now leveraging that approach, it really makes sense that they be explicit in the profiles themselves. And there are a couple of really good reasons for that. First of all, it makes them machine processable, and it also makes them render and display in the IG publisher generation of the profiles, which I think is a really good thing, especially for software developers trying to adopt the specification. I think the only arguments one can have against doing this would be concerns about what the rendering looks like. And I admit, if you have lots of actors and lots of obligations, then that might be a concern. I don't think AU Core is going to have that many. And further, if there ever were that many, we can always approach the tooling team in HL7 to make rendering of those obligation extensions easier from a readability or editorial perspective. But I think for me, the key argument in always including them is that it's machine processable and rendered along with the IG.
What is machine processing of these things like?
Machine processing. Oh no, Ruben, you could probably cover that better with your hat
I'm
as
sure
Deputy
we
FHIR
can
Director.
jointly respond to that. So if we leave these things out, Richard, then it's down to human processing, i.e. reading the AU Core spec and seeing which obligations apply in plain English as specified in the AU Core IG. Machine processing means that a software library or tooling application or a validation engine can get the profile, see which obligations apply because they're there as FHIR extensions with URLs and codes, and act appropriately. So that's the sort of machine processing I'm talking about.
I'm wondering how that works out in detail. So this would feed into a code generation. It would feed into a code snippet selection. It would feed into testing of instances against this. I'm not sure how it actually works out in practice.
There's a few tooling things already in practice on how that might work out around tools in and of themselves for this. So things like automated generation of test suites that will be using this kind of thing. There's a couple of the cases that I think are that there's a lot of chatter going around on international about when your system has to or you're trying to implement multiple IGs to really understand and get tool-driven help to try to get a cohesive picture of what your obligations actually are across implementing multiple IGs, because you're no longer trying to read through these kinds of things. You can feed these through tooling. I know that's one that quite a few people I've heard of are quite excited about and trying to produce tools for that. And
well,
I think, sorry, yes, Ruben?
I'd say the best example of machine processing is the IG publisher itself. Unless you have those extensions on those elements, the obligation will not be included in the IG that gets generated by the IG publisher.
I mean, I can see downstream profiles being able to leverage this. Perhaps there's some ability to ensure that you're not using a weaker obligation than what the upstream IG, for example, wanted. All of those codes we're talking about there has a hierarchy, so there is there is some confusion perhaps of what the hierarchy actually means, but let's say it's an is-a relationship. So things like persist, for example, is a part of handle, which is a part of the shall populate, etc. So there is this hierarchy. So in theory, we could do that. In addition, I think I've heard IPA and IPS, like comparing them against other IGs and saying, are these the same? They say they're must support, but are they actually the same obligation or meaning of must support across IGs?
Yeah, it strikes me from what you're saying that the machine processable is valuable for comparing profiles and seeing whether you've got something comparable across different profiles, and valuable for generating examples. I don't see how it would help you generate software, because a lot of this stuff isn't actually part of the software behavior, the particular software behavior. But the discipline of using such coded values would aid could aid implementers when they're looking at this.
Just before we go to Andy, some of those obligations are actually would be like that, like ignore, reject, invalid, and a whole bunch of other things can drive some of the software libraries. The ones we've chosen in AU Core are priority neutral, so maybe not so much. Andy?
If I fed an IG which was augmented with obligations into my friendly FHIR stack and it was doing validation, would it then ensure that data that was being stored within that FHIR server for that particular profile had at least a data value or missing or suppressed as part of the instance, and therefore it would be directly kind of part of the validation kind of engine itself? I don't know whether that's currently done, but that to me is the most useful part of this whole thing, is to ensure that when I've got a bunch of clients out there who are looking at putting data into my FHIR server, that I'm not manually having to add functionality around my FHIR server to do that check itself.
I think for mandatory that would be okay, but I think for optional it's pretty hard to test because you're really needing to understand the capability of the application on, does this application have this field in this database? The validator will never know that. Whereas for a mandatory one, yes, it would be useful.
Yeah, but as a contributing client of a FHIR service, I've got data and I'm putting it into the FHIR server, whether that was a mandatory or optional, it wouldn't, if it was if I include the attribute in my resource, then the attribute is either a valid entry for that particular attribute, or it's a missing attribute, or it's a suppressed attribute. So it's one of those three. Whereas if it was obviously mandatory, you can't leave it out, but I can still check against the three. Whereas normally, if it's included, the only thing I'm going to check against is probably the definition in the IG of that resource. I wouldn't necessarily be checking for missing or suppressed.
So we've got 6 minutes left. So I'll go Ruben quickly. And then I'm probably going to ask people if they're to put their hands up for those people who are interested in having obligation extension in the AU Core IG and R1. So Ruben?
I'll be very brief. I just want to be clear on what it is we are debating here. Current state is we will support the obligation extension on obligations beyond those default ones. So really the only thing in question here is whether we also support them for those default obligations on requester and responder. My argument is yes, we should, for all the reasons I've stated before. And so I just want to clarify to everyone that there isn't a question that we will use these extensions for other obligations. So we're just debating whether they're there for everything where we have must support, or just for the ones beyond the default ones. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks. And that, yes, that sounds good. So can I get a hands up on who is for the inclusion of the obligation extension on the elements in AU Core, on the elements for which we flagged my support? All right, that's still climbing. All right, that's over half the people, but I'll get you to put your hands down now, and I'll ask shortly some of the other options. Not yet. Okay, I'll ask people to put their hand up if they are against having the obligations in AU Core, the obligation extension across the elements. No one. Okay, I think that's a really pretty clear indication that that's how we're going to form that response to the ballot comment, and that's what that is going to be that we'll put out for the block vote, which is one of the things we really wanted to get to today. I also want to leave everyone with, because we haven't walked through it, what some of that really looks like for AU Core and a couple of things that we can do in addition. So I put in the beginning of the chat the build branch, because we've already put this into a branch of AU Core that you can look at on what are all the things we've been talking about today. What does that look like? And I'm going to send you a link now. That's going to change slightly because it also mocked up whether or not we would have must support on performed date time. So I'm going to put in a link. Have a look at that. Please get back to us. So by that, I'm thinking maybe email me or Heath with anything in there if you want to provide some feedback for that, because that's going to be really the shape of what we're putting forward as the next step in AU Core for ballot reconciliation that we can then keep working through and make some further refinements. So that's the early draft that I've just put in. And we'll take out the performed date time that was in there. All right. Any other comments or questions for people that you want to walk through before we finish? All right then, thanks everyone again. Really appreciate everyone coming along to these Conformance Fridays and helping us work through what that actually looks like in FHIR and AU Core. Next Friday is ballot reconciliation. So we're going to be doing some voting. That is now going to include some of the must support and obligation stuff, but it'll also include some of the results from previous meetings, including whether or not we revisit gender identity and individual pronouns. So that's next Friday. I'll see you there, 10th of May. Thanks, everyone.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.